Welcome to My Life Chassidus Applied, episode 364. This program is dedicated in loving memory of Tov ben Aaron HaKohen Moskovici, whose yahrzeit is today the 16th of Nacheim Av. We're moving now from the saddest 9 days of the year, which concluded with Tisha B'Av last week, into the elevation that follows. As the Arizal explains, Chof Av, which was just yesterday, the 15th of this month, is unique among all 15ths of months because it's the full moon, the first full moon following the Begam Halavana, the wound, the injured, the scarred moon, Malchus, dignity, which is personified by Tisha B'Av. So when the moon becomes full, it comforts us, and it reflects the elevation of Malchus. The Levana is Malchus. In our personal lives, it's the dignity of a human being, the dignity of a Jew, the dignity of Malchus, that each of us is unique, is like a king and a queen in our own domain, meant to really elicit from us the divine image and the divine soul that lies embedded in each person. The Churban Beis HaMikdash, the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, in a sense, scarred, wounded that Malchus on all levels, including in each one of us. And Chof Av, the 15th of Av, is the Aliyah, the elevation that comes after the descent, where the moon is full, and it reaffirms that not all is lost, God forbid, and that we will rebuild, and we do rebuild, as we see in Jewish history, both individually and collectively. So we're just coming from the 15th of Av, Shabbos Nachmu, the first Shabbos of the 7 Shiva de Nechemta, the 7 weeks, which will conclude the Shabbos before Rosh Hashanah, 7 weeks of comfort. And this is comfort not just about memories of what happened, but it comforts us, each one of us, in our lives today. Whatever we're going through, whatever challenges, whatever difficulties, losses, tragedies that we've experienced, Hashem Yishmar, the Eibusher, should protect us all. But even if something like that has happened, there's a Nacheim. And a comfort isn't just soothing the wound, but also giving us strength to get through it and continue to grow. And that's what we're coming from. We're on the 16th of Av. This week is also Chof Av, which is the yahrzeit of Rabbi Levi Yitzchak, the Rebbe's father, passed away in Tov Daled. And it's also the week of Parshas Eikev. We read Parshas Eikev, which will be the second of the Shiva de Nechemta, of the 7 weeks of comfort. In the spirit of Chassidus applied, we look to apply all of this based on Chassidus, based on the Maimorim, the Siches, the letters, the directives of the Rabbeim, to our personal, psychological, and emotional lives. Okay, so with that, since I mentioned Chof Av, let me just talk a bit about that, as well as Nachamu, and then we'll move to Chof Av. There was some follow-up questions regarding Nachamu. One person writes, if God made promises to Avram, to Abraham, that he would always be with us and support and protect us, why do we need a Shabbos Nachamu? Are there times God turns his back on us and then feels bad afterwards, so he has to console us? Or is God just trying to keep us on a short leash? It seems that way. Well, neither is the fact. Obviously, the question can be asked about every blessing that we receive and every positive statement made in the Torah. Once God promised Avram Avinu and Yitzchak and Yaakov certain promises, why does he have to continue to promise again and again? So the basic answer across the board is that, on the contrary, the more promises, the better. Life is difficult, as we all know. Living in this world, in Elam Hazeh Gashmi V'Achumri, in this material and coarse world, which is, as he says in Tanya, Mole Klippos V'Sitra Achra, filled with all types of distractions and coverings and concealments, to the point that it's the Shoim Gevrim by the wicked dominate and can prosper, the good people can suffer. It's a world that's a difficult world, and we need a raya from Tanya. Just look around. Not an easy world, especially in Golus. So every promise we can get, we take. So the more we get from Hashem, the question would be, why doesn't He give us more promises? Not sure why you would ask that question. The bottom line is, every promise delivers another piece of strength. It's just like saying when somebody's in a state where they need help or support, so you don't just say, okay, I'll give you support, and then I don't have to tell it to you again because I already told it to you last time. I love you, I don't have to repeat it again. I told it to you, why don't you rely on what I said a month ago, a year ago, or 10 years ago? So this is a constant relationship between God and the people. It's a continuous partnership. And just as we have to constantly renew our commitment, Hashem renews His commitment. This explains in general all what Shabbos is, what Yom Tov is, and every year another Yom Tov, and Rosh Hashanah will come again. You could say we already received it once, the renewal of the contract. But no, every year we want to renew the contract in a deeper way. And the same thing every week, Shabbos, the worlds are elevated and we're elevated again. It's not a repeat, it's on a higher level, in a deeper dimension. So in real relationships are dynamic. They're constantly in flux and constantly in movement. And there's always the ongoing commitment, both partners, in this case, the Eibishter and us. So in addition to what happened to Avram Avinu, in addition to all the other promises we received, then comes, unfortunately, the tragedies that had happened on Tisha B'Av. So the Eibishter now comes and comforts. Nachmu nachmu ami. He sends his prophet and says, console, comfort, twice, comfort my people, my nation. Dabar al Lev Yerushalayim, speak to the heart of Yerushalayim. Since we're already mentioning it, the heart of Yerushalayim. Speak to the heart. It's not just enough to speak to Yerushalayim. A tremendous lesson in life, that when you comfort someone, it's not just words, even they're sincere words, but it's not just words, it's also speak to their heart. Find a way, words from the heart enter the heart. Like a face is reflected in water, a heart is reflected in another. So all that is part of the process of healing and how we comfort one another. And this is the general state. And more specifically, each promise that God gives us, each comfort is fitting and commensurate to the issues that are being addressed. In this case, we're talking about Nechama, Shiva de Nechemta, after Thlasa de Poronisa, after the 3 weeks of affliction. We get 7 weeks of comfort. It's interesting, 3, 7, they add up to 10. Yes, and it's explained the 3 is Chabad, as the Rabbi Hillel explains that the 3 Chabad is because God is concealing His revelation, like the teacher who goes deeper into his Chabad in order to reveal a greater revelation to the student. But from the student's perspective, it's a concealment. And then it begins the Amshacha, the 7 weeks, and the Shiva Midas, the 7 emotions that draw down and reveal this deeper revelation, leading into the 2 weeks, the Tiyufta, the Gemara continues, the 2 weeks of Tshuva, which is the 2 weeks after the 7 of comfort, where we say Haftarah is connected to Tshuva, around Rosh Hashanah, to Yom Kippur, Shabbos Tshuva, and so on. So, that is the significance of Nachamu. The 15th of Av question came this way. Dear Rabbi Jacobson, regards from Pennsylvania, can you please explain why the 15th of Av was a big joyous holiday in the times of the temple and why it's no longer observed today? It says in the Talmud that when the month of Av, another question, it says in the Talmud that when the month of Av comes in, we must diminish in joy. So therefore, why was the joyous holiday of the 15th of Av held in the month of Av? Maybe it should have been postponed until Elul. Okay. Well, regarding the first question, there are many things that were in the time of the Beis HaMikdash that do not continue. Begashmius. The time of the Beis HaMikdash, the Gemara explains why the 15th of Av was such a holiday. So there's different explanations, the Gemara and Tainus at the end, and one of them is actually connected directly to the Beis HaMikdash. Yom Taber Magos, the day when they broke the axe. The axe they would use to cut the wood that was used in the Beis HaMikdash, they stopped cutting the wood because in the summer, So the 15th of Av, signifies the day when the nights begin to become longer and the days shorter. The sun, the more it shines, the more the wood was dried, and therefore perfect. Eliminating worms or other things that would not allow the wood in the Beis HaMikdash to burn smoothly. So the 15th of Av was designated as the day when they stopped cutting the wood. So that became a holiday in that sense. That the Rebbe cites very often. That's why after Tu B'Av, as the nights get longer, slowly get longer, and the night is created in order to learn, that we should start learning more Torah every day, every night, from Tu B'Av and on. So that explains very specifically why it's connected to the Beis HaMikdash. But even the other reasons were also regarding the different things with the Shvatim. This is the day when they determined the different yichus, when they clarified who came from which shevet. Many of these things are not relevant today because they're only applicable time of the Beis HaMikdash. But that's the Gashmi's part of it, the physical. The spiritual part is absolutely relevant. As I quoted from the Rizal, and the Rebbe discusses it every year, literally, at Tu B'Av, especially in the later years. The elevation that comes after Tisha B'Av, that happens every year. Like it is with many things, that when the time of the Beis HaMikdash was done physically, very thing like karbonos, offerings. Today we don't have physical offerings, so we have tefillas became karbonos tiknu. We have prayer. Everything that was then is also here today. The question is whether it's physical or it's spiritual. And the spiritual significance of the 15th of Av we discussed this week and last week. Regarding the second question, this is exactly the point. You don't want Tu B'Av and El. You want in the month of Av, in the month of pain and loss, that's where you want transformation. So specifically the 15th of the month, the full moon of Av, which will then lead 2 weeks later into El and the rest of the elevations that come in the month of El. But this is exactly, precisely why it's in the 15th of Av. A few more questions. Why is the focus of Tisha B'Av on the 9th of Av on the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash? What about the millions that were killed during that time of the destruction of the Second Temple? Why don't we speak about what the Jewish people were going through at that time? I've heard that more Yidden died in the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash than in the Holocaust. First of all, destruction of the Beis HaMikdash is not the only thing we talk about. If you read Kinnus that we say, the sad Kinnus, and the Lamentations, the book of Lamentations, Eicha, actually begins, Eicha Yoshva Bodod. Yerushalayim is sitting alone. It's not even talking about the Beis HaMikdash yet. Yerushalayim is alone. And then it continues to talk about the people that resided there. So throughout Tisha B'Av, we're constantly remembering everything that happened. The destruction of the Beis HaMikdash is used as the key thing because that's where it all rooted. God's presence on earth. When God's presence in a physical Beis HaMikdash is complete, that seamless connection protects us from everything else. Once that is breached and that is destroyed, everything else followed. So the tragedy is the whole picture. What happened to the Beis HaMikdash? What happened to the people? What happened to the Golos? The Pnei Chateinu Golinu Ma'artzeinu. That we were exiled, physically and also, most importantly, spiritually, displaced from the natural environment of being a channel, a dwelling place for the divine in this world. So Tisha B'Av captures all of that. And of course, the Aliyah that comes afterwards also captures that. That's why the full moon of Tu B'Av and all the elevations that follow are, again, not just purely about the Beis HaMikdash, by Beis HaMikdash, and extends to the Beis HaMikdash inside each of us. It extends into the Malchus of each human being and all of us as a collective whole, as we stand together. Okay. How can we say in Shemoneh Esrei on Tisha B'Av, the original Nacheim, which includes words that seem not applicable today? Factual words that Yerushalayim is empty and the like. It's very hard to push in the meaning that it's talking about spiritual emptiness, as even in that realm, there's so much now in Yerushalayim. I don't have the nusach in front of me as I'm typing this, but saying it today and thinking about the words made me feel uncomfortable. Can you please look at this tefillah and address that? I'm not sure why you're saying that it can be applied spiritually. As a matter of fact, in spiritual emptiness, it's even more applicable. regardless of what's going on in Yerushalayim today, yes, you can have malls and restaurants and people milling about, and there's a lot of energy and bustling energy. When we're talking about, when we say even the Jews in Israel say that prayer on Yom Tov in Musaf, because Galina Martzenu, as I just mentioned before, is not just a physical exile. It's not just banished from the land of Israel. It's banished from the spirit of Israel. So you can be in Eretz Yisrael, you can be by the Kaisel and be in Golus. So Golus is a deeper thing. The Nacheim that we say on Tisha B'Av, which the Arizal, as I discussed last week, actually says that's because birth of Moshiach at that moment, in that Tisha B'Av afternoon when the flames were at the highest, refers to all forms of destruction. Yerushalayim, the holy city of Yerushalayim, the Beis Hamikdash, are obviously the symbol, the physical symbol of it all. And it begins because you want to have it in this physical world, we want that connection. But every word there can be and is explained in a spiritual way. I'm not sure why you're saying it's forced. It's just as forced as saying that Tfilas b'mkeim karbanos tiknum, that we don't have offerings, and avodah today is through davening. Chazal tell us that's exactly how it is. As a matter of fact, everything begins first, medaberes be'elyenim and meramezes betachtenim. First the Torah speaks in the spiritual realms, and then it applies it into the physical realms. So all that is absolutely applicable. Since this question was asked, this question also had a follow-up, which is not relevant to this, but I'll decide that I'll address it. And maybe in the same context, can you please address other such seemingly inaccuracies? It's not my word, this is a writer's word, and I would correct it. It's not inaccuracies, these are accuracies, you just have to know how to understand them. Imreiku mikemhu, we're told. If we don't understand it, it's not inaccurate, it means that we are lacking something. So, to please address some other ways of understanding, such as in Birchas HaMozen, in Grace After the Meals. In Nusach Chabad, we say, Rachman hu yevorech es avi meire balabayis hazeh. Hashem should bless Avi, my father, the balabayis, the owner, the host of this home. And we say that in all locations, not only while sitting in our father's actual home. So there too, the answer is quite straightforward. Even when you're eating elsewhere, you still have a father. And even people physically don't have a father, you still have a father in heaven. Both the Eibishter, but also your father always remains your father. That's why during the Kfar Chabad we say, Tate, the Kfar Chabad. Even when we're not even at our father's table, or even when our father is not physically here in this earth. Because we always remain connected to our father. Father represents more than just sitting at the table. The Torah and its tefillas and all of the yukim in every verse is precise. So when it says things, it's trying to evoke. Why do we say that? Besides gratitude, which is the obvious reason. We're saying thank you to our father, to our mother, to our parents, to the people who provide for us. But you're also acknowledging the blessings in your life that come through your parents. And those blessings continue even if they're not sitting with you physically. They give birth to you. And those parents thank their parents. And this is how we connect generation to generation. And this remains with us. We call the Ovis. We say Alikei Ovis. Even though they're long not here physically in this world, they continue to be our patriarchs. They continue to sustain us. They continue to bless us. So no matter where we are, we say this prayer in this context. Okay. Let me now go back, since this week is Chof Av. So let's talk about Chof Av now and Parshas eikev. So Chof Av, as I said, is the yahrzeit it's the 77th yahrzeit of Levi Yitzchak, who was himself a great grandson of the Tzemach Tzedek, father of the Rebbe. Earlier on, they didn't know that he passed away in Almatah, where he's interred and where he is, where he's buried. That's where the Tzion is. And at the time, they didn't know it was Chof Av. There were questions when exactly was the yahrzeit, but then they found out. For the Rebbe, it was always, you saw, a deeply personal and emotional thing. His father was not able to be Kadesh U'Rechatz for so many years. physically speaking. You see the same with Yosef and Yaakov. Yosef was away from Yaakov, so he was able to perform that great mitzvah. But it's more than just the mitzvah, it's the connection. And you could see how the Rebbe honored and really would do anything for anyone that did even one favor, or in some way served him, brought him some food, helped him in any way. The Rebbe felt indebted forever to these people. And we saw this all the time, different individuals. The door was always open for what they did for the Rebbe's father. You have to remember Chof Av, Tovshin Daled, when he passed away, the Rebbe was already in the United States of America. He probably, the last time he saw his father could not have been before, after 1927. Tofresh Pei Zayin was when, Tofresh Pei Ches was when the Rebbe left Russia together with the Frierdiker Rebbe. So we're talking now 1927. So when the Rebbe saw his father last, we can't really know exactly. It was definitely in the 20s at some point, because he came to the Frierdiker Rebbe, the Rebbe, 1923. But regardless, we're talking about from 1927 till Tovshin Daled, it was 1944. We're talking about a good 17 years. The Rebbe would reunite with his mother in Tovshin Zayin. She came out of Russia. The Rebbe went to France to greet her and bring her back to America. So the connection of the Rebbe and the Rebbe's father, the connection of any child and a father, especially a Rebbe and his father, especially under these circumstances, carries a lot of deep meaning and significance to us. As our Rebbe, we look at the Rebbe as honoring his father. Not just davening the Amid Chof Av, but also the Farbrengens, the Siyumim, which was always a hallmark, a key part of the Farbrengens and Chof Av. Talking about even Chof Av, before the Rebbe became Rebbe, we have a Siyum HaMasechta Nida in Tovshin, I believe it's in Tovshin Vov, or Tovshin, those early years, the Rebbe said a Hadran, and so every year. So there is the personal connection. On a deeper level, when the Rebbe's father's manuscripts and writings, and we know there was a real lot more than we have, began coming out, the Rebbe Tzachana, who was Moshe Nefesh, as the Rebbe said many times, she didn't have anything to write with. It didn't have ink. She would take different herbs and different plants and turn them into different ink. And we can see it actually on the gloss that he wrote on Zohar and on Tanya. You could see different colors, red, green, blue, strange colors. It came from these different inks that his Rebbe Tzachana made. And when they began coming out of Russia, which was a whole story of its own, and the Rebbe first saw them the first time, the early 60s, the Rebbe began, besides the value and publishing them all, the Rebbe began to explain them. Every Shabbos, the Farbrengen, just like there was a Rashi and a Pirkei Avos, and later years a Rambam, he would also explain his father's notes. First, the Rebbe talked about his father's notes on Tanya and Geras HaTshuva, and then Tanya in general, and then the Rebbe's father's notes on Zohar. Every week, there was a schedule right after the Rashi questions the Rebbe would ask on Rashi. After the Maimer, the Rebbe would ask questions on Rashi, then he would ask questions on his father's notes, and then explain it. Very often would say that my father, because of the limited time he had in the limited space, he didn't write everything. He relied that we would understand the lessons in Avodas Hashem and other details. So we have now volumes. We have 4 main volumes of the Rebbe Levi Yitzchok's Torah, 2 volumes on Zohar. We have the volume of letters that he wrote to the Rebbe, many letters, as well as his Torah on Chazal, on different psukim, and primarily Chazal. So there's on Zohar, Chazal, and Meir Chazal, and the Gemara. Later years, there were found new manuscripts here and there, so they would publish them as separate entities. And then, of course, the Rebbe's explanations on all of this, which is its own series of talks that we have. So someone asks a question, what's the Rebbe's father's most famous Torah? It's very hard to answer that question. It's like asking, what's the Rebbe's most famous Torah? I can't really answer the question most famous. I'll share a few that come to mind. One that I always was it's a short vort, but it comes from Rabbi Levi Yitzchok. When we say on Shmini Atzeres and on Pesach we say L'chaim v'loy l'movis when we talk about the tefillas tal, tefillas geshem. L'chaim v'loy l'movis on the rain. So L'chaim v'loy l'movis. Ask Rabbi Levi Yitzchak. Once you say L'chaim to life, why do you have to say not to the opposite of life? That's what Chaim is. The opposite. Say L'chaim. That's it. So Rabbi Levi Yitzchak and Fabring once said, then said, because you can be loy l'movis. A person could be not physically dead, God forbid, but they're also not fully alive. So L'chaim v'loy l'movis means not just not to be dead, not to be a total zombie or a vegetable. I mean, in the spiritual sense of the word. But L'chaim means more than. In other words, life is more than just the absence of death. Just like love is more than the absence of hate, and shalom, peace, is more than the absence of war. I'm adding that. I believe Yitzchak didn't say that. It's a powerful vart. Talks about, in other words, how to live the fullest life possible. And not just a life of that you're around biologically surviving, but also true life. Another Torah that comes to mind that maybe the most famous simply because it's most published is the one that the Rebbe cites in the Haggadah of Pesach, the Rebbe's notes and the Rebbe's Haggadah where his commentary on the Haggadah. So right in the beginning, in a similar way, not the first thing the Rebbe writes, like Rashi writes, Omer Rabbi Yitzchak, which hints to his father, but the Rebbe does talk about his father in Kadesh U'Rechatz, right? In the beginning of the Simonim, there's 15 Simonim, the 15 steps of the Haggadah, and the Rebbe brings Kadesh U'Rechatz. Why, of all the 15, there's only one where you have a Vav, Kadesh U'Rechatz. You don't say Kadesh U'Rechatz. Like the others, you say Karpas Yachatz, Magid, and then the rest of them, Magid, and then Moitzi Matzah. You don't have a Vav anywhere, a Vav that connects. There are 15 separate steps. But by Kadesh U'Rechatz, there's a Vav. And the Rebbe adds another question that his father, he says, I heard from my father, that these the only two that in the language of a tzivui, a command, not a sipur dvarim. The others are telling you what's happening as if it's a narrative. Kadesh U'Rechatz says, Kadesh, sanctify yourself. U'Rechatz, wash. Like later, Rachza doesn't say wash. Rachza means washing. And the Rebbe explained the name of his father. He says, I heard from my father, Al Derech Hasod, that Kadesh U'Rechatz, Kadesh goes on Chochmah, U'Rechatz goes on Bina, Kedusha, Havdalah, which means separate. Kedusha, Kiddush is Chochmah. The Bina goes on Tara, Rechitza, to wash and cleanse. In Kabbalah it says that the Kadesh goes on the three Gimel Rishenis of Chochmah, meaning Chochmah Bina Das in Chochmah, or Keser Chochmah Bina in Chochmah. And Bina is the Dal Rishenis of Bina, which is the four Keser Chochmah Bina and Das, within Bina itself, or not Das. It says the Dal Rishenis of Bina probably means Keser Chochmah Bina Chesed maybe. And he says these two levels of Kadesh U'Rechatz were not affected by Shviras HaKelim, by the shattering of the containers, because they're in a high spiritual level. And that's why, because they're protected by Atik. Atik is a level, the highest level of Keser. And that's why it says Kadesh U'Rechatz together, and the language of a command. Because it's saying, it's commanding us, telling us, take these first Kadesh U'Rechatz, the sanctity and the purity of Chochmah and Bina, together, and make sure that you draw them now into the other 13 lower steps, next steps of the Haggadah. So essentially, it's like taking these two higher levels, they come together, Chochmah and Bina, and Kadesh U'Rechatz, the sanctity and the purity, and draw them down into the other 13, which come after Kadesh U'Rechatz. Karpas, Yachatz, and Magid, Moitzi Matzah, and so on. So that's a word that he brings there, which of course its lesson is quite clear as well. In our lives we have things that are broken, and we have things that are never broken. You want to be able to draw from the non-broken part within our souls, within the higher levels, into the rest of our lives. So even the areas that are subject to or vulnerable to breaks and to trauma or into losses are also elevated. The Rebbe doesn't say this part, I'm just applying that. Okay. Later in this program, at the end, I talk about the Chassidus question, we're going to discuss what was the contribution of Rabbi Levi Yitzchak to Chassidus, because the Rebbe, in the later years, began to also cite Rabbi Levi Yitzchak's Teres, even in the Maimonic Chassidus that he said. When the Rebbe would speak all the Maimon in a Maimer, and he would bring all the Rabbeim, and quite a few Maimonim, Baseless for sure, and others as well, he also would bring his father's Teres. What does that contribute? We'll discuss that later. Did the Rebbe ever comment about the Magen David on his father's matzeivah? That although it might not be our custom to put on a matzeivah, on a tombstone, but since someone made it, we should keep it there and not remove it. I did not hear something directly. I recall something vaguely that they asked the Rebbe, but it was made that way and it was never touched. That doesn't say anywhere that a Magen David is a bad thing. The reasons, as a matter of fact, we always used to hear that the Rebbe had written some long essay on what a Magen David is, its roots, and where it originates from. But it never was found, so I don't even know if it's a true rumor or not. But regardless, a Magen David has its symbolism, and it's used in many halachic locations and so on. So I never heard that the Rebbe in any way suggested or was suggested to the Rebbe to remove it. But I will do more research, and maybe if any of you have heard something about this, it would be very interesting. I'll be happy to share it if you write to us. And here's a good opportunity. Go to chassidusapply.com. There's a forum there where you could submit any question completely anonymously, as well as any information that I could use to be able to share with others. So that is what I know about this topic, or what I don't know, I should say. Okay. On a practical level, to bring out the lessons to us, Rabbi Levi Yitzchak, being an extension, first of all, coming from the Tzemach Tzedek, and being an extension to us, relevant to us through the Rebbe, Rabbi Levi Yitzchak plays an important role. Chof Av is a day of taking on achlotis. The Rebbe writes that it's his chus, that on this day, to inspire us and to request that we learn the Torah of Rabbi Levi Yitzchak. The Rebbe also mentions that Chof Av is 40 days from Rosh Hashanah, before Rosh Hashanah, and based on the Gemara, Arboim Yom Kedem, before 40 days before a child is born, you're already machrizin, they already announce different things about this child. So 40 days before Rosh Hashanah, before the rebirth of the world, is a significant day where you begin to prepare, especially as we follow from the 15th of Av, and it's moving into Elul, days of beginning of the preparation to the month of Elul, and the request of the Rebbe to add in Teira Aveidig Milas Chasodim, connection with the schus of Rabbi Levi Yitzchak and Chof Av. Learning his Teira, of course, we have today, as I said, his Sfarim, we also have the Rebbe's explanations, so it's not a difficult thing to do. And that's one of the ways we honor. The Rebbe also established Teferes Skenim Levi Yitzchak in Tov Shem Mem Beis, 1982. He established in the most Chabad houses, if not all, have that special organization dedicated to creating a kollel for people who are already not working or not working full time to learn Torah. Teferes Skenim Levi Yitzchak in the Rebbe's father's name. And many other things. As I said, the Rebbe would make siyumim and Chof Av. So siyum was always part of learning Torah, siyum and Gemara, siyum and Shas, which is the custom to do on a yahrzeit. And of course, above all, the iskashus, the connection that we have to the Rebbe, and by extension to the Rebbe's father, and also the lessons of Givat Ayleh that we saw, the tremendous lengths the Rebbe went to. We saw the Rebbe's mother every day visiting her, but also and how the Rebbe honored his father through the people that had did anything for his father, even one little thing, became a major contribution, and the Rebbe always honored that. So we know the lessons from that, to honor our own parents. Okay. Lessons from Pashas eikev. What does eikev mean, and which mitzvos fall into this category? Dear Rabbi Jacobson, please help me reconcile something I've been thinking about. The 10 Commandments were given separately because they are the most important commandments, And we've been taught that within those 10, they're the source of all the 613. As I discussed actually last week in episode 363. I've also been taught that an explanation for the pasuk Vayihei eikev tishmun is this. Since eikev means a heel, eikev also comes from the word eikev, a heel, the lowest part of the body, it's an illusion that the lesser publicized and easier and simpler commandments are just as important as all the others and must also be obeyed with the same diligence. My issue is, it doesn't reveal anywhere exactly what these lower commandments are. And also, wouldn't it have made sense that just as we were given a 10 commandments of the 10 most important, we should also have been given a separate 10 commandments of the eikevs, so we can know which they are and that they're also important to emphasize. Thank you, and may you have a week full of inspiration and good news. Okay, so first of all, V'hoya eikev tishmum, there are many different interpretations of the word eikev. Some interpret it very simply, V'hoya eikev tishmum, because you have listened to God's commandments, therefore you get the brachas and the blessings that come afterwards. But Medrash mentions the word eikev in a context that eikev means that even the mitzvahs shadoshin aleim, ima eikev, even mitzvahs that seemingly people ignore or even step on them like with a heel, which means like this person just wrote, you should also be diligent and careful with them. Chassidus brings, it's a Chassidic, eikev also from the word ikvus of the Moshiach. The mitzvahs that are connected to eikev, the heels of Moshiach, the times in the later days before Moshiach comes, is called eikev, and it's referring to those mitzvahs. The Rebbe explained that has a connection, obviously, to what's ikvus of Moshiach. It's a time when there was no divine revelation. So mitzvahs can be seen in a way almost like an eikev, like a secondary thing. In other words, I won't say the word derogatory, but eikev is not the head, but eikev as like the heel. And that too, on the contrary, doing mitzvahs, the eikev of the Moshiach, the Mesiras Nefesh, that comes from the heel, can elevate the entire body, including the head, and even higher. So there's different interpretations. It's pretty clear why the Torah would not enumerate these mitzvahs, because if people have such an attitude, the Torah is not looking to in any way, God forbid, speak about a mitzvah in a negative way. Because they're not lower or inferior to other mitzvahs. It's just in human mind it may be that way. They're things that we, for some reason, neglect, or we take for granted. When you walk on something, you take it for granted, you're walking it, you don't respect it properly. So the Torah is telling us. So the Torah to go enumerate and say, here they are, doesn't want to formalize it. That's pretty clear. But the beauty here is, like when we say in the Mishnah, that al tehei shekel, a person shouldn't go measure and weigh the value of mitzvahs, which is a greater, but you should be careful. In a more lenient mitzvah as in a harsher mitzvah, or a severe one. Like when we talk about, let's say, the mitzvah of Anochi Hashem Elokecha, or we know there's the prominent mitzvahs that are the foundations. So you can come to mind and think, okay, other mitzvahs, they're not as fundamental. No, but when it comes to Ratzon Hashem, God's will, every detail is as equally powerful. I remember in the late 60s, so Rabbi Zalman Posner they did an interview on the radio that the Rebbe listened to, where one of the questions asked him is, why does God really care about all these little details? It's one thing, the fundamental principles. So he explained it the way he explained it, and the Rebbe on Shabbos spoke about it, and actually used an example from NASA, because then there was talk about there was landing on the moon and other developments, how every detail matters. You take a computer program, one dot, extra dot, or one less dot, will cause the whole program not to work. In the human body, God forbid, one mutation among 75 trillion cells. So details may seem not much when you look from the outside, but in the context of looking for a big picture, every detail matters. It's not about kamus, it's not about quantity. So that's what Hoya Eikev Tishman comes to teach us. And as Ikvus is the Moshiach, even though the neshamas may not be on the same level as in previous generations, especially earlier generations, and yet each of us has our indispensable role. To say that anything is negligible or less important than another is absolutely not correct. Shava mashva kotem v'gadol. From God's perspective, everything is equally valuable. The fact that it's called mitzvah chamura or mitzvah kala is yes, because technically speaking, in Giluyim, certain mitzvahs draw down more energy than others. But in the area that each one has to play, they're completely indispensable, and every one of them needs the other. Take away one of the 613 mitzvahs, the whole building is affected. Just like if one Jew was missing at Matan Torah, Torah couldn't have been given. If one letter is missing in the whole Sefer Torah, even though you have Anochi Hashem Elokecha and Shema Yisrael and everything, one letter, even a letter about the story Achos Leighton Timna, where you're talking about the family of Esav, doesn't make a difference. Every letter, one letter is missing, even one letter is cracked, let alone missing. It's already, the whole Sefer Torah is puzzle. Because when it comes to the big picture of things, every detail is absolutely necessary. Okay. Eikev is also the second week of the Shiva de Nechemta, and as the Avraham writes in a beautiful, eloquent way, that all the 7 weeks of comfort is a narrative, the narrative and dialogue between the Eibishter and the Eden. First, the Eibishter says, Nachmu, Nachmu, Ami, tells the prophet, comfort the Eden. The Eden then come back and say, why you destroyed the Beis HaMikdash, why are you sending a messenger to comfort us? And God says, correct. And then the fourth week, Anochi Anochi Umenachemchem. I, just like Nachmu, Nachmu, double. I will comfort you. So we have to look at this period in time as our dialogue with God. When we are challenged, we came to from the tragedy of Surfside, which was the 9 days and the 3 weeks, and all that came before that, all the events in the last year, 2 years, in general, personally or collectively. So we are now in the 7 weeks where we have a dialogue with God. And it's not just about comforting, it's about growing. It's about healing. It's about mending. And ultimately, as Moshe Rabbeinu was on the mountain begging God for forgiveness for the Chet HaEgel, and ultimately prevailing through the month of El, the compassion, all of it is a journey in the continuing narrative and dialogue between us and God, individually again and collectively, where we find opportunities now to be able to find deeper strength and also deeper healing, and ultimately the ultimate healing, the Gula Amitis Vashleim. So it's important to keep in mind where we are, that time is energy. The energy of our time is the healing, the reconciliation, the rebuilding after scars, wounds, destruction, betrayal. This is the time where we're in, so it's important to take advantage and tap into the special energy of the Shiva de Nechemta, the second week of comforting and consoling. Okay. Well, we've covered. Next question, completely from a different direction. How should we react to Ben and Jerry's boycott of Israel? Okay. Ben and Jerry's ice cream is in the news for joining the BDS movement and refusing to sell their product in Israel. Just like Haman thought that he had a good plan by picking the month of Adar for his plot, and he was fooled because Adar was also Moshe Rabbeinu's birth month. So the Jews really had a good mazel. Maybe we can say that Ben and Jerry are actually doing Israeli Jews a big favor by helping stop the spread of diabetes from high sugar foods. Okay, the problem is there's other ice creams and other high sugar foods, but I understand the sentiment. My question is, has the Rebbe ever said that in the period before Mashiach's arrival, there will be such confusion that some Jews will join the side of our enemies? Another person writes, is Jews turning against Jews, is that a sign of Mashiach's coming? I don't remember the Rebbe saying that. I mean, the Rebbe did say Purim Mem Zayin another time, Tavshim Mem Zayin, that when you see things that don't seem consistent and even go backwards, more darkness, even though we're closer and closer to Mashiach, that too is a sign, Yisbararu v'yislabna advarim. We see clarity, crystallized clarity. So you see people where they really are, instead of people hiding behind, and we don't know what their real intentions are before Mashiach comes, as in the Sefer Daniel, Yisbararu v'yislabna advarim. Things will become very clear. So to see an enemy is better than not to see one. Regarding Jews who are misinformed or worse, it's very sad because it comes down to literally not information, buying into propaganda, buying into a distortion and a myth of the Jewish behavior as Israel, and as all these boycotts demonstrate. I mean, do they boycott the abuse of rights in Arab countries or in other countries? We all know the double standard, but it's very sad when you see Jews buy into it. So we all can bemoan the fact, but I think the most important thing is it puts the responsibility on us to be more proactive and more aggressive, and I mean in a good way aggressive, meaning not passive. Go out there, take initiative, proactive, to teach, to educate, to enlighten, to inspire. People don't know. There's so many myths they don't know. They simply don't know about Israel's behavior, even to their own enemies, sometimes at their own detriment. And people need to be taught. And this isn't just being proud of Eretz Yisrael or being committed no matter what. Of course, Jews can make mistakes. It's just Israel can make mistakes. But overall, you see the attitude. Any country has treated their own enemies this way. It's unheard of. And yet Israel is vilified. But this is a big part of the war, is a propaganda war, a war of public opinion in the media. And this only teaches us how much more we have to educate. We have responsibility to teach, to inspire, and to enlighten. That's how I see it. And whether it's a sign or not a sign, at the end of the day, what action do we need to take? This is the action that we need to take. Another question. Again, unrelated. There are stories told about the Baal Shem Tov that he would often go into the forest to meditate and pray. My question is it advantageous to pray in the forest over praying inside a city? Aside from the peace and quiet in the forest and lack of city noise, distractions, is there a benefit to praying in the forest because we are surrounded by nature and we can see the world in a manner closer to the way it looked when God created it before we built up cities and turned them into concrete jungles? Thank you. Yeah, we say also that Arizal would go out into the field to greet Shabbos, l'chodedi. There's something pure about davening without human structures. Even though the Beis HaMikdash and a Mikdash Ma'at, which is a synagogue, is a mini sanctuary, is created out of materials, man-made materials. Nevertheless, we do find the idea, you find it when you see the Siach Basoda, Yitzchak went out to speak in the field, to daven in the field. There's a certain connection to the natural world around us. Now, I'm not even getting into the issue where some people have told me, I remember we did a Shabbaton, camping Shabbaton, we davened outside in a tent. And there are dinim also about davening outside in a respectable way. So I remember someone telling me, it's the first time I davened in 30 years. Because their synagogue that he went to was not only empty and soulless, he says it was also hurtful and abusive. I mean, it was a bad environment. Polluted was the word that he said. So unfortunately, there are structures that are polluted. Sad. So just having that like a cleansing experiencing of connecting just to nature itself, meditating around nature has a certain power. And perhaps the Baal Shem Tov and the Arizal and others teach us that. But again, there are halachas around this as well, just for the record, about davening in an open place. There's respect when you have a structure around you or something where it's confined to some extent. But the spirit of it makes total sense, and many of us do find that type of purity when you get away from the city and the noise and the distractions. And in general, the man-made concrete and metal and all the buildings, as great as they may be. Look, Sukkot reminds us that it's not the buildings that give us security, it's God. So even a portable shack works. So there's that element of that organic connection and holistic connection to nature that's untouched by human beings. Each person has to make a decision how that works. I see no reason why, especially in the summer when we travel, to go outside and speak to Hashem. It's beautiful. It could open up new doors. It's a type of like fresh air, a new way of doing things. But again, always know that there is also great value in the Beis HaMikdash, in the Mikdash Ma'at. It's not taking away from it. It also brings to mind the story with the Baal Shem Tov, where he once went into a shul, and he came running out, and he said, he can't daven there, it's too packed. And they looked, the shul was pretty empty. What do you mean packed? And he said, the Zohar says that without Ava V'yira and Kavona, a tefillah is like a bird without wings. Means it can't can't fly upward. The prayers are not lifted, and the shul was so filled with prayers, basically like grounded birds. So he couldn't go because he felt that tension of the prayers that were grounded prayers without wings. So maybe that also has sometimes an element to be able to go out in the field, or out in the forest, and other ways of understanding how we appreciate connecting to Hashem in many, many different ways. Okay. Well, more questions. The questions don't stop coming. I have to apologize to some of you who've written questions, and I know it takes time till I get to them. Someone just told me a few days ago, I wrote questions and I see you didn't answer them. No, it's not intentional. It's definitely not deliberate. It's because there's such a backup. It's hard for me to catch up. I'm not even sure how to catch up, to be honest. Maybe that alone needs a contest to figure that out. But I will do a little follow-up, and then I will do the Chassidus. Here we go. In last week's episode, Dear Rabbi Jacobson, I watch your Sunday night podcast every week, and I wanted to comment that yesterday's, meaning last Tisha B'Av's edition was one of your best programs. The way you arranged all the questions into a perfect flowing essay was amazing. Thank you for all the hard work you do. It is greatly appreciated by people like me that live upstate in the forest and don't have access to brick and mortar synagogues to study and pray in. Well, very kind of you, very touching. Thank you. Dear Rabbi Jacobson, on your Sunday night program, you read a letter and confirmed the writer's thoughts that since baseless hate destroyed the Holy Temple, that baseless love is a way to rebuild it. My question is this. In the 1960s, the essence of the hippie movement was about peace and love. Since they spent a decade promoting baseless love, wouldn't it have been appropriate for God to send the Moshiach then and rebuild the base temple during that time? Well, that's an interesting question. But you can go back in history. There are many times there was baseless love. Not sure why you're choosing the 60s. Second of all, even though, yes, that was a beautiful aspect of the 60s, there were also other things going on that were not exactly halachically aligned. So I'm not here to criticize, I'm just here to point that out. I don't know if we look at things that way. Whatever reasons Hashem has when he brings what, Moshiach didn't come then. Was there an opportunity? There was. In 1967, actually, what they call the Summer of Love. The Rebbe's Summer of Love was that we have now an opportunity to love God like never before after the 6-day war. And now is the time that people should come and gather and honor and love God. I once wrote an article about the Summer of Love in that sense. So there was definitely an opportunity. But we have to look now where we are now. What can we do to introduce more baseless love than ever before in order to finally bring the Geula? Another person follow-up, Kamtza and Bar Kamtza. Dear Rabbi, in regards to Kamtza and Bar Kamtza being related father and son, which you discussed last week, please find attached the Masha al-Asar, the Masha on the Gemara in Gittin, and he does actually say, and maybe this is a father and a son, that's why Kamtza, and Bar Kamtza, the son of Kamtza, and the Shliach, who the host sent, he sent him to the wrong person, he sent him to the son, instead of to the father. In other words, he sent him to Bar Kamtza instead of Kamtza, and that caused all the problems. The Mashal goes on to explain this. Thank you for that. That's a good point. I did ask. And so there is about Mashal, but he says Efsher, which means it's not definite, but it makes sense because that's where their names are. Okay. And it adds more to the whole drama of now being a father and son. It wasn't just two strangers. talks about that he considered that the shliach didn't make a full mistake. He thought maybe he can make shalom, since it's the son of his friend, maybe he can make shalom, which of course didn't work out exactly that way. Okay. Finally, let's do the Chassidus question. What is the Chassidus question? How should we categorize the Rebbe's father's contribution to Chassidus? We know there's the 7 Rabbeim, the Alter Rebbe, Chabad, Chassidic Chabad, 9 starting from the Baal Shem Tov, Chassidus are close. Baal Shem Tov, the Magid, the Alter Rebbe, Mittler Rebbe, Tzemach Tzedek, Rebbe Marash, Rebbe Rashab, Friedrich Rebbe, and our Rebbe. And that's 7 Rabbeim, Rebbe being Malchus, Teira Shvi. And yet we see that the Rebbe did introduce his father's Torah in his Sichos, as I mentioned before, and in his Mamorim as well. And we see it's included, so-called in the canon of explaining Chassidus. It's included in many different places. So it's a good question. Now, of course, the Rebbe Chas v'Shalom didn't come to add another Rebbe. Rabbi Yitzchak is the Rebbe's father. We don't call him a Rebbe. And yet, he was a great Chassid and contributed through his father. I once heard that the Rebbe, Rabbi Yitzchak, that Rabbi Yitzchak was once farbringing. There were some Chassidim who were questioning and making noise a bit. They were distracting him. So he said, what do they want? So someone said, they want to know what your source is. Where are you getting all of this from? And he said, everything comes from Likutei Torah. Everything he writes comes from Likutei Torah. Now, when you look in the Torahs of Rabbi Yitzchak, it's not exactly all Likutei Torah, but it could all be based on it. But that's what he said. Ishemis. So for sure, it's Likutei Torah. So how do we contextualize it? It's interesting also to note, and this is probably deliberate, he did not write his Torah like a Maimer. Maimorei Chassidus are written a very specific way. And all the Rabbeim never wavered from that way. It begins with a Pasuk, or a Maimer Chazal, or Lahavan Inyan, asks questions, goes into a discussion, and then comes and concludes with answers. Rabbi Yitzchak does not do that in his Torah. Now, I can't speculate, we can't know, but it's very clear. He never does that, which means he wanted to clearly distinguish that I'm writing is not a Maimer Chassidus from a Rebbe. Even the Chassidim that said and wrote Maimorim, Rabbi Hillel, Paritcher, Rabbi Isaac Homler, there they do a Dibra HaMaschal. Rabbi Levi Yitzchak didn't do that. So what is his contribution? We could say, and this is based on some of the different sichos that Rebbe spoke about, Rabbi Levi Yitzchak is al derech hasod, like I mentioned before from the Haggadah. When you learn Kuntres and Yonash Teres Chassidus, you come away with realizing that Chassidus is Yechida. There's Pshat, Remez, Drush, Sod, Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama, Chaya. Sod is Chaya, Kabbalah is Chaya. And Yechida, which encompasses them all, as the Rebbe explains there. You can say that Rabbi Levi Yitzchak is the Seid Shebi Yechida, because everything is called. There's Nefesh Sheba Nefesh, Ruach Sheba Nefesh. There's the Nefesh Sheba Yechida, the Pshat in Chassidus. There's the Ruach, the Nefesh, the Ruach in Yechida. The Remez in Chassidus. There's the Drush Sheba Chassidus, is Neshama Sheba Yechida. And there's the Sod Sheba Yechida. That Rabbi Levi was the Sod. And you see that in all his Torah, he speaks Chassidus, but he's always connecting it to the Sfiras and to Kfar Chabad and the Zohar and other Sifrei Kabbalah to ground it. Like he writes to the Rebbe in one of the letters, that whenever you speak something, always connect it to the Chelik HaSod, then it'll be kafter v'ferach, it'll be perfect, it'll be seamless, and it'll be grounded in the Chelik HaSod Sheba Torah, from where then comes into Drush, into Remez, all the way to Pshat. That you could say is his contribution, which of course then is also part of Chassidus, the Sod within Chassidus. Okay. Finally, let's do the essays. So we are the 6th annual My Life Chassidus Applied Essay and Creative Contest, 31st place winners. The essay in English is The Passionate Life, adding vitality and joy into your everyday. Sarala, Weinstein, student, MBCM, Monsey High, hometown, Spring Valley, New York. The essay in Hebrew for men, Tachlis v'yud ha'adam ba'elam b'ashkofas teres Chassidus. The purpose of a person in this world through the eyes, through the lens of Chassidus, perspective of Chassidus. Meir Heber, student, Kfar Chabad, Israel. The essay in Hebrew, women, lies isha, to be a woman. Mrs. Penina Geldtzeler, Givat Ayleh in Israel. And finally, the creative, inspiration versus internal motivation, a video by Penina Geldtzeler, age 21, Shlichus, Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. The English essay and the creative can be seen at ChassidusApply.com. The Hebrew essays at diralo, diralo.org, where you can look at all these and all the previous ones that are all posted there. Again, a tribute to your Chutza, people from all walks of life, taking Chassidus, applying it to real issues in our contemporary lifetime. Okay, with that, we conclude episode 364 of My Life Chassidus Applied. We're here every Sunday, 8 to 9 p.m. Everyone have a Nachamedika week, a comforting week, a Simchadika week. And may we march to the Gula Amitis Vashlema, even still in these last days of Av, and march into Elul and Tishrei with the Gula Amitis Vashlema, Moshiach Tzidkenu. Everyone be well. Thank you.
This program is brought to you by My Life, Chassidus Applied. Please help us continue our programs. Make even a small contribution at chassidusapply.com/donate.